There was an engine in the late 1980s that made more horsepower per liter than any American V8, got better fuel economy than four cylinders, and weighed 200 pounds less than the small block Chevy. GM engineers created it, tested it, and proved it worked. Then GM management looked at the sales projections, realized it would cannibalize their entire V8 business, and killed it. The engine that could have changed American automotive history was buried because it was too good at its job. The Quad 4. That's the engine GM destroyed because accountants decided protecting V8 sales was more important than building the best engine possible. Here's what it could do, why GM killed it, and how that decision cost them billions in the decades that followed. GM launched the Quad 4 in 1987 as a 2.3-liter dual overhead cam four-cylinder. This doesn't sound revolutionary until you see the specs: 150 horsepower stock, 180 horsepower in high-output trim, 190 horsepower in the W41 racing version. That's 82 horsepower per liter from a naturally aspirated four-cylinder in 1987. Here's the comparison that terrified GM management. The 5.0-liter V8 in the Camaro made 170 horsepower. That's 34 horsepower per liter. The Quad 4 made more than double the power per liter, while weighing 397 pounds compared to the V8's 575 pounds. It got 32 mpg highway compared to the V8's 24 mpg, and it cost less to manufacture. But here's what the engineers knew and management feared. If you dropped the Quad 4 into a Camaro instead of the V8, you'd have a car that was lighter, faster, more efficient, and cheaper to build. The performance would be nearly identical, but the fuel economy would be 30% better. That's the dream scenario for consumers. It was a nightmare scenario for GM's business model. The entire company was built on V8 profit margins. Small block Chevy engines had massive economies of scale from decades of production. Switching to advanced four cylinders meant retooling factories, retraining workers, and abandoning infrastructure they'd spent 40 years building. The Quad 4 was better engineering, but it was worse business. The Quad 4 wasn't just efficient, it was genuinely fast. The W41 racing version made 190 horsepower and 160 pound-feet of torque from 2.3 liters with no turbocharger or supercharger. In 1989, that was supercar-level specific output. Ferrari's Flat 12 made 73 horsepower per liter. Porsche's turbocharged Flat 6 made 68 horsepower per liter. GM's four-cylinder was beating European exotics on power density. The Oldsmobile Cutlass Calais with the W41 Quad 4 ran 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds. That matched the Camaro Aero C with the 5.0 V8. A four-cylinder Oldsmobile sedan was as quick as Chevy's performance car. Journalists testing the Calais couldn't believe a four-cylinder was producing these numbers. But here's the problem. GM didn't anticipate. The engine was so advanced that it made their entire V6 lineup obsolete. The 2.8-liter V6 made 125 horsepower. The 3.1-liter V6 made 140 horsepower. The Quad 4 made 150 to 190 horsepower from 2.3 liters. Why would anyone buy a V6 when the four-cylinder made more power with better fuel economy? GM had invested billions in V6 production. Plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Mexico built millions of V6 engines annually. The Quad 4 threatened to make all of it worthless. Engineers saw this as progress. Accountants saw it as destroying existing profit streams to build new ones that might not materialize. The Quad 4 used dual overhead cams when most American engines still used pushrods. It had 4 valves per cylinder, when GM's V8 had 2. It used aluminum block and head construction when most domestic engines were still iron. It had a 10.0 to 1 compression ratio, when most American engines ran 8.5 to 1. Every single design choice was state-of-the-art for 1987. The variable intake manifold was particularly advanced. Below 4,000 revolutions per minute, intake runners were long for low-end torque. Above 4,000 revolutions per minute, they switched to short runners for higher RPM power. This gave the engine broad power band that most four-cylinders couldn't match. You had V6 torque at low RPM and four-cylinder efficiency at cruise. It was the best of both worlds. But here's the technology that really mattered. The Quad 4 could hit emissions standards without catalytic converter warm-up delays that plagued other engines. It ran clean from cold start. This meant it met California's strict emissions while making more power than engines that barely passed federal standards. GM had accidentally created an engine that solved problems they didn't know needed solving yet. By 1990, California emission standards were forcing other manufacturers to detune engines and add emissions equipment. The Quad 4 passed everything with no detuning. It was built for regulations that wouldn't exist for 5 more years. GM had an engine that would have given them a massive competitive advantage through the 1990s. Then they killed it. The official story is that the Quad 4 was too rough and loud for mainstream buyers. It had harsh vibrations at high RPM. The DOHC valve train created mechanical noise. Customers complained. This is all true. It's also incomplete. Here's what actually happened. GM had focus groups test the Quad 4 in various cars. Performance enthusiasts loved it. They accepted the rough edges in exchange for power. But mainstream buyers hated it. They wanted smooth, quiet engines, even if that meant less power. The focus groups told GM that the Quad 4 would work in performance cars, but not mass-market sedans. This created an impossible business case. Performance cars are low-volume niche products. If the Quad 4 only worked in performance applications, GM couldn't achieve the economies of scale needed to justify continued development. The engine needed to sell in hundreds of thousands of family sedans to make financial sense. But family sedan buyers rejected it for being too harsh. But here's the decision that killed it. GM had 2 options. Option 1 was invest heavily in refinement to make the Quad 4 smooth enough for mainstream buyers. New engine mounts, revised valve timing, different intake design. This would cost hundreds of millions and take 3 to 5 years. Option 2 was stick with existing V6 engines that customers already accepted and use the Quad 4 only in low-volume performance applications. They chose Option 2 because the payback period on Option 1 was too long and too uncertain. By the time a refined Quad 4 reached the market, competitors would have their own advanced engines. The window of technological advantage would be closed. Better to protect existing V6 sales than gamble on 4-cylinder refinement. The decision made financial sense in 1992. It was catastrophic by 2002. In 1995, Honda released the B16 engine, 1.6 liters, 160 horsepower, silk-smooth operation. It proved you could make a high-strung 4-cylinder that normal people would accept. In 1998, BMW released the M52 inline-6 with 190 horsepower from 2.5 liters and refinement that made V8s feel crude. European and Japanese manufacturers figured out the refinement problem GM abandoned. By 2005, GM was behind in every performance metric that mattered. Fuel economy, emissions, power density, refinement. The Quad 4 would have given them a 7-year head start on technologies that became mandatory. Instead, they spent the 2000s playing catch-up with competitors who solved problems GM had identified in 1987, then walked away from. But here's the cost in dollars. GM spent $4.2 billion between 2000 and 2008 developing new 4-cylinder engines to replace the outdated designs they'd kept in production through the 1990s. The Ecotech family, the high-feature V6, the direct injection systems, all of it was playing catch-up to technology they'd already invented with the Quad 4 then abandoned. If they'd invested $500 million in Quad 4 refinement in 1992, They would have saved $3.7 billion in redundant development a decade later. The technology was already there. They just needed to make it acceptable to non-enthusiasts. They chose not to, then spent 7 times as much money redeveloping the same concepts from scratch 10 years later. Imagine a 1990s Camaro with a refined quad 4 making 200 horsepower, getting 35 mpg highway, and weighing 3,100 pounds instead of 3,400. It would have destroyed the Mustang. It would have competed with European sports coupes at half the price. The performance would have been identical to the V8 version with dramatically better fuel economy and handling. The Corvette engineers specifically requested a high-output version of the Quad 4. They wanted to build a lightweight mid-engine Corvette using a twin-turbo 4-cylinder making 300 horsepower. This car got as far as running prototypes before management killed it. The excuse was that Corvette buyers expected V8 SEPs. The reality was that a 300 horsepower 4-cylinder Corvette would have cannibalized Z06 sales. But here's the car that needed it most. The Pontiac Fiero. GM's mid-engine sports car had terrible engines. The base 2.5-liter 4-cylinder made 92 horsepower. The optional V6 made 140 horsepower. Both were ancient, inefficient designs. The Fiero with a 190 horsepower quad 4 would have been a legitimate Ferrari competitor at 1/10 the price. GM built exactly 23 Fiero prototypes with the quad 4. Test drivers reported the car was spectacular. Power-to-weight ratio matched Porsche. Handling was world-class. Fuel economy was better than Honda Civic. GM canceled the Fiero in 1988 rather than put the Quad 4 in production. Too much cannibalization risk for Camaro and Corvette sales. The Quad 4 dominated SCCA World Challenge racing from 1989 to 1992. Oldsmobile Cutlass Calais with W41 engines won the championship 3 years running. The engine was reliable, powerful, and easy to modify. Race teams were getting 250 horsepower from naturally aspirated 2.3 liters. For context, that's Formula One power density from 1985. But here's what the racing program proved. The Quad 4's problems were solvable. Race teams refined the valve train, smoothed the power delivery, and reduced vibrations without losing performance. Everything GM said was impossible in a production engine, privateer race teams accomplished with basic modifications. The technology worked. GM just needed to implement the race team solutions in production. They never did. Racing success didn't translate to production development because management had already decided the engine's fate. The racing program existed to sell high-performance versions to enthusiasts. It was never intended to validate production improvements. By 1993, GM withdrew factory support. The engine that was winning championships was being phased out of production. The final Quad 4 rolled off the assembly line in 1994. 7 years of production, 1.2 million units built, 3 racing championships won. Then discontinued because it threatened more profitable product lines. If GM had committed to the Quad 4 and developed it properly, the entire American automotive industry would have evolved differently. Ford would have responded with their own advanced 4 cylinders earlier. Chrysler would have abandoned V6 development sooner. The domestic manufacturers would have been competitive with Honda and Toyota on efficiency without sacrificing performance. But here's the bigger impact. The SUV boom of the 1990s happened partially because domestic automakers couldn't compete with imports on car efficiency. They pivoted to trucks and SUVs, where fuel economy standards were looser and V8 sets still made sense. If GM had viable high-efficiency performance engines, they might have remained competitive in passenger cars. The Quad 4 represented a philosophical choice: invest in advanced technology that threatened existing profit streams or protect existing technology and accept gradual decline. GM chose protection. Toyota and Honda chose advancement. By 2008, the consequences were clear. GM was bankrupt. Toyota was the world's largest automaker. The Quad 4 development team knew they'd built something special. Engineers who worked on the project have given interviews saying it was the most advanced engine GM had ever produced. They solved problems that Toyota wouldn't solve until 2000. They created technology that BMW wouldn't match until 2005. Then they watched management kill it to protect V8 sales. But here's the human cost. Nobody discusses. The best engineers left GM after the Quad 4 was canceled. They went to Japanese manufacturers, German automakers, and Silicon Valley tech companies. GM spent decades recruiting and training world-class engineering talent, then demonstrated they wouldn't support innovative work if it threatened existing business. The brain drain that followed was catastrophic. By 2000, GM's engineering teams were focused on incremental improvements to existing designs. The culture of innovation died with the Quad 4. Engineers learned that proposing breakthrough technology was career suicide if it cannibalized existing products. The company became conservative, risk-averse, and technologically stagnant. GM killed the EV1 electric car in 2003 because it threatened gasoline engine sales. They killed the Pontiac brand in 2010, despite it being profitable because it competed with Chevrolet. They killed the Volt plug-in hybrid platform after investing $2 billion because it cannibalized truck sales. The pattern is consistent. When new technology threatens existing profit streams, GM kills the new technology. But here's what makes the Quad 4 different. It was killed before the internet, before social media, before enthusiasts could organize and protest. The decision happened quietly in corporate boardrooms. By the time car enthusiasts realized what they'd lost. And that's why GM filed for bankruptcy in 2009, while Honda and Toyota didn't. One company made hard decisions about technology, even when it hurt short-term profits. The other protected existing business until there was no business left to protect. The Quad 4 was just the first casualty in a pattern that eventually destroyed the company. The engine GM killed didn't just threaten their V8 lineup, it threatened their entire business model. And rather than adapt the business model, they killed the engine. That decision cost them everything.